Kale Voss was not the kind of man who spoke much. He had learned a long time ago that in rooms full of powerful people, the ones who listened carefully always walked out, knowing more than the ones who talked. So he sat in his chair inside the grand assembly of Vareth Prime, and he listened, he watched, and he noticed things that other people missed. Grand Assembly was the most important room in the known galaxy. It sat at the top of a tower made of pale blue stone that had been carved by the Vareth people 6,000 years ago. The tower was so tall that its top disappeared into the clouds, and when you stood at the windows of the assembly hall, you could see the entire city of Vareth spread out below like a glittering map. Ships moved in the sky like slow stars. Banners of 47 species hung from the walls. The hall smelled of incense and old wood, and something electric that no one had ever been able to name. Kale had been sitting in this room for 11 years as the human ambassador. He had watched debates about trade routes and border lines and resource rights. He had listened to species argue for hours about things that did not matter and stay silent about things that did. He had smiled when alien senators made jokes about humans behind their hands, when thinking he could not understand their languages. He understood all of them. He had always understood. Today, the hall felt different. It was not something he could point to easily. The lights were the same. The senators were in their usual seats. The translator systems hummed quietly as always. But something in the air had changed. There was a tension that reminded him of the way the sky looked just before a thunderstorm, heavy and waiting. He had noticed it 3 days ago. The Vareth elder who always greeted him in the corridor had looked away when Kale tried to catch his eye. The Drenali senator, a tall creature with silver skin and 4 arms, had cut off conversation the moment Kyle walked into the room. Small things easy to miss if you were not paying attention. Kyle was always paying attention. The session began with routine matters. A trade agreement between the Morath and the colony people, a dispute over a moon in the outer sectors. Cal kept his face calm and neutral, and he took small notes on the flat screen in front of him, but he was not really listening to the words. He was watching the faces. Senator Yavata of the Drenali kept checking something on his private screen, and then looking up at the ceiling. The Corvani delegate, a round creature covered in dark fur, was gripping the edge of his desk so hard that his knuckles had gone pale. The Vareth elder, whose name was Sareth, once sat very still with his long fingers folded and his yellow eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He had not spoken once since the session began. Sareth always spoke when the routine matters ended. The head of the assembly, a Vareth woman named Chancellor Abeth, announced that the next item was classified and that the public feed would be cut. Screens went dark across the hall. Doors were sealed. Security drones moved to the corners of the room. Cal leaned forward slightly. A young Vareth aide walked to the center of the floor and activated the main display. A star map appeared, a wide view of the galactic rim, the far outer edge of the galaxy where the stars grew thin and cold, and the darkness between them was very deep. A red marker was blinking at a point far beyond the last known Concordat outpost. The aide cleared his throat. He looked nervous in a way that made Cal feel something cold move through his chest. The signal, the aide explained, had been detected 17 days ago by a deep range listening station near the rim. It was a repeating pattern, not random, not natural. Something was sending it, something very large and very deliberate from a point in space that no known ship had ever reached and returned from. The signal had been identified by the Concord's oldest archivist, people who spent their lives reading records that went back thousands of years. The pattern matched something in those ancient records were the Wrath Can. When the aide said that name, the room changed completely. Kyle had seen alien senators debate with fury and passion and cold calculation. He had never seen them go pale before. He had never heard a room full of 47 species go completely, absolutely quiet. All at once, as if every living thing in the hall had stopped breathing at the same moment. He had never heard of the Wrath Can. He made a note of that. The aide continued. His voice was very steady, harsh, which Kyle respected because everything about the man's body said he wanted to run. The Wrath Can, the aide explained, were a civilization, if that word even applied, from beyond the galactic rim. They had appeared once before 40,000 years ago. The records from that time were incomplete because most of the species that had lived through it had not survived to write much down. What was known was simple: the Wrath Can moved in fleets of unimaginable size. They did not negotiate. They did not take resources or land or prisoners in any way that made sense. They simply arrived and then things stopped existing. 14 species had gone extinct the last time. 14. The aide finished speaking and stepped back. For a long moment nobody said anything. Then the room erupted. Senators were on their feet. Several were speaking at once. Kyle caught pieces of different languages. Fear in all of them, the same fear dressed in different words. The Corvani delegate was speaking very fast and quietly to the person beside him. The Jornali senator had his face in two of his 4 hands. Senator Sarath still had not moved. He sat like a stone statue while chaos swirled around him. And for just a moment his yellow eyes met Kyle's across the room. Then Sarath looked away. Kyle leaned back in his chair. He breathed slowly. He looked at the blinking red marker on the star map, still floating in the center of the hall, far out at the rim, Ari at the edge of everything. He thought about what he had just heard. He thought about the way the room had gone quiet. He thought about the way the Varith Elder had avoided him in the corridor for 3 days. They had known, not for 17 days. Longer. They had been having conversations about this without him, without any human present. He was certain of it. He could see it in the way they were arguing now. Not the way people argue when they are hearing something for the first time, but the way people argue when a decision they have already been discussing privately has finally been brought into the open. The assembly eventually called for a recess. Senators moved in tight, fast clusters, speaking in low voices. No one came to speak to Kyle. No one looked at him. He walked through the room like a ghost, unhurried, hands in his pockets, and let himself be invisible the way he had always been invisible in this hall. He took a long route back to the human quarters of the diplomatic complex. He walked through corridors that were mostly empty at this hour, and he looked out the wide windows at the city below, and the sky above it, and the faint dusting of stars beginning to show as the evening came in. He had always loved the stars. He had grown up on a station in the asteroid belt far from Earth, and he had spent his childhood pressed against windows, just like this one, counting lights in the dark. He thought about 14 species. Gone just clears throat, gone the way a candle goes out. He sat down at the small desk in his private room and opened a communication channel. It was encrypted with a code that the Concordat did not know existed. He had used it only twice before in 11 years. His hands were steady when he typed. He wrote to Admiral Sareth Mace, whilst he wrote to the one person in the human command structure who had the authority and the knowledge to understand what he was about to say and to do something about it. He wrote that the Concordat had received a signal. He wrote what the signal was. He wrote the name the archivist had given it and everything the aide had said. He wrote about the 14 species and the 40,000 years, and he wrote about the way the senators had looked and the way Sareth had not spoken and the way nobody had come to talk to him during the recess. He wrote one last line before he closed the channel. He kept it simple because there was nothing complicated to say. The situation was very clear. He wrote, "They are coming and no one here is going to fight." He sent the message. Then he turned off the desk light and sat in the dark for a while looking out at the stars through the window. The city hummed below him. Ships moved through the sky. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. But the silence felt different now. He had lived long enough to know that there were two kinds of silence in the universe. There was the silence of peace, which was warm and full like a room where everyone inside felt safe. And there was the other kind, the kind that came just before something terrible, when the world held its breath without knowing why. This was the second kind. As if he did not sleep that night, he sat in his chair by the window and he watched the stars and he waited. He was good at waiting. Humans were when they needed to be. They had a patience in them that other species rarely saw and almost never understood, a deep and quiet stubbornness that looked from the outside like stillness but was really something else entirely. It was the stillness of a person who already has a plan. In the assembly hall, lights were still on. He could see the glow of the tower from his window. Senators were meeting through the night. He was sure of it. Species that had spent centuries arguing about small things were suddenly speaking very quickly about very large ones. Some of them were probably already talking about surrender. Some were probably already writing letters to their home governments, explaining why fighting was not realistic. Some were probably already thinking about which planets they were willing to give up first. Eka watched the tower lights and said nothing and thought everything. Somewhere out beyond the rim, in the deep dark where the stars ran out, something very old and very large was moving toward them. It had no record of humanity in its memory. Humans were not important enough to notice. Not yet. That, Kale thought quietly to himself, was exactly the way they wanted it. He waited for morning, and somewhere across the vast dark of space, a woman named Sarah Mace was already reading his message, already standing up from her chair, already walking toward a door that led to the longest corridor in the most secret facility humanity had ever built. The stars outside Kale's window burned on, cold and bright and beautiful, completely unaware that the darkness between them was about to change forever. The facility had no name on any official document. It did not appear on any map that the Galactic Concordat had ever been allowed to see. It had existed in a place that most people would describe as nothing, a wide, cold region of space between two outer star systems where there was no planet, no station, no signal, and no reason for anyone to ever look. That was, of course, the point. Admiral Sarah Mace had been the commander of this facility for 19 years. She had given up a great many things to do this job, a home, a family of her own, a life that people back on Earth could understand if she described it at dinner. She did not regret any of it. She was not built for regret. She was built for this, for sitting in the center of something enormous and invisible and making sure it was ready for the day it would be needed. She had just read Kale's message for the third time when she stood up. She was not a tall woman. She had short, gray hair and dark eyes and the kind of face that had stopped looking young a long time ago, not because of age exactly, but because of the weight of knowing things that most people did not know. There were lines around her eyes that her staff called worry lines when they thought she could not hear them. She called them thinking lines. There was a difference. She walked out of her office and into the main corridor of the facility's command level. The corridor was long and curved, slightly because the whole structure was built in a ring, one, and if you walked far enough in one direction, you would eventually come back to where you started. The walls were plain gray metal. The lighting was steady and white. There were no windows anywhere, because windows created heat signatures, and light scatter and heat signatures and light scatter were things that could be detected. Nothing about this facility could be detected. That was the first rule. The oldest rule, no, the one that had been written into the original project charter 150 years ago by people who were now long dead. The project had started as an idea in the mind of a woman named Dr. Yuan Hao, a theoretical physicist who worked for a small Earth research group that most people considered eccentric and most governments considered barely worth funding. Yuan had spent her career studying dark matter, not the dark matter that astronomers had known about for centuries, the invisible mass that held galaxies together, but something stranger, anomalies, places in deep space where dark matter behaved in ways that the standard models could not explain, places where it seemed, under the right conditions, to respond. She had written a paper about it. The paper had been politely ignored by the mainstream scientific community. It had not been ignored by a very small, if very quiet, group of people inside the human government who read everything with the words deep space and anomaly in the same sentence. 3 years after that paper was published, Yun Hao had been given a research station, a budget that no one outside of 2 offices knew about, and a simple instruction: find out if it is real. It was real. That was 147 years ago. Yun Hao had been dead for 80 years. But her work lived in every ship that now existed in the dark around this facility, in every system, in every weapon, in every engine. And the basic principle that dark matter was not just a background feature of the universe, but a medium, something that could be entered, shaped, used like water or fire or air. Mace had not built any of this. She had inherited it, added to it, trained people to operate it, and spent 19 years making sure it was ready. She sometimes thought of herself less as a commander and more as a keeper, a caretaker of something that had been passed down through generations of people who all understood the same thing. The galaxy did not see humans clearly. They never had in the 200 years since humanity had been admitted to the galactic concordat. They had been treated as a young and backward species, clever perhaps, but emotional and unpredictable, and not yet ready for real responsibility. While they had been given observer seats in debates they were not allowed to vote in, they had been assigned border zones that contained nothing of real value. Their ships were inspected at Concordat checkpoints in ways that no other species ships were inspected. Their scientific papers were reviewed by Concordat committees who sometimes approved them and sometimes simply never responded. Every human diplomat who had ever sat in the Grand Assembly had felt this. Kyle felt it every day. Or would they all felt it? And for 200 years they had all made the same quiet choice. They smiled, they nodded, they filed the paperwork, they thanked the committee, and in the dark, in a place no one could find, they built. Mace reached the operations room, which was the largest space in the facility. It was a wide circular room with a high ceiling and a central display table that currently showed a real-time map of the surrounding region of space. And the room was staffed around the clock by people who worked in 12-hour shifts and who had all gone through a selection process so thorough that most of them described it afterward as the hardest thing they had ever done. They were the best, not just the best. Humans the best. She stood at the edge of the room and looked at the display for a moment. Then she spoke. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She had found over the years that people listen more carefully to a quiet voice than a loud one, especially in important moments. She said that she needed all senior staff in the briefing room in 10 minutes, she said at once. Then she turned and walked to the briefing room herself and stood at the front of it and waited. They came quickly. 8 people around a table, all of them experienced, all of them looking at her with the same expression she always saw when she called an unscheduled briefing. Alert, controlled, eagerly waiting. She told them about the signal. She told them about the Wrath Khan. She read them Kyle's message in full. Every word. She told them what the Concordat archivists had found in the ancient records. 14 species, 40,000 years. When she was finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then her chief engineer, a man named Dov Rash, who had been with the project for 30 years and who was the closest thing Mace had to a friend in this facility. He said, "So this is it," Mace said. "This is it." Another moment of quiet, then everyone began doing their jobs. The next 6 hours were the busiest Mace had seen in 19 years of command. Systems were activated that had been in standby mode for decades. Checks were run, crew rosters were pulled. Long-range communication arrays that had never been used in anything above a test signal were powered up and aimed at coordinates across human space, or at the people who needed to know what was coming. And then came the moment that Mace had spent 19 years preparing for. The moment she had run through in her head so many times it sometimes appeared in her dreams. She authorized the full activation of The Darkfall Fleet. The fleet was not kept in a dock. It was not sitting in rows like ordinary warships. It existed in the dark matter layer surrounding the facility, held in a state that human physicists described with mathematics, and most people, if they had been told about it, would have called impossible. 3,000 ships, each one built to principles that did not exist in any Concordat design manual, each one capable of moving through dark matter, the way a fish moves through water, invisible to every sensor system the galaxy had ever developed. They did not reflect light, they did not emit heat. When they moved, they did not leave a trail. When they existed technically in the space between ordinary matter, in the layer of the universe that other species had mapped and measured for thousands of years without ever imagining that something could live there. Each ship had a crew. Those crews had been training in shifts for years, cycling in and out of the facility in ships disguised as research vessels and cargo haulers. They knew their ships the way a person knows their own hands. They were ready, one by one, across a wide region of dark space. Engines that produced no exhaust and no light began to run. Displays in the operations room showed their status as small indicators, shifting from yellow to green one after another, spreading across the map like something slow waking up. May stood at the display table and watched it happen. Dove came to stand beside her when he was a big man with a quiet manner, and he had the habit of standing slightly behind her left shoulder as if he was trying to take up less space than he actually did. He said 3,000 ships. Admiral. She said 3,000. He said after a moment, they never asked us what we were building out here. She said, no, clears throat. Never did. She thought about the conquered senators in their tall hall with their 47 banners. She thought about 200 years of small humiliations dressed up as cooperation. She thought about border inspections and committee delays and the quiet laughter that stopped when a human walked into a room. She thought about Yuan Hao, who had been ignored for publishing a paper that turned out to be the most important document in human history. She thought about all the people who had worked in this darkness year after year, without recognition, without credit, often without any of the things that people usually work for. She thought about what they had built in exchange for all of that. She looked at the map, 3,000 green lights in the dark arranged in a formation so precise that it looked from above like a living thing. Something snorts, breathing and enormous and patient. She said to no one in particular and to all of them, wake the fleet. The order moved through the facility like a current. A word went out on encrypted channels to every ship in the formation and across a region of space that no Concordat sensor had ever looked at twice. 3,000 ships that did not exist began quietly and completely to move. Somewhere far away on a planet called Varith Prime, a man named Kale Voss was sitting in the dark by a window, watching stars he had loved since childhood, waiting in the way only humans could wait, with a patience so deep it looked from the outside like peace, high from the surface of that planet. If anyone had been watching the sky with exactly the right equipment at exactly the right moment, they might have noticed something strange. A small region of space near the outer rim where the stars were visible one moment and then, very briefly, were not. as if something vast had moved between them and every source of light in the universe, and then the darkness moved on, and the stars came back in the sky. Looked exactly as it always had, but it was not the same sky anymore. The first thing people noticed was that the stars near the rim went dark, not all at once, not in a way that looked like an explosion or a collapse. They went dark the way a fire goes dark when something very large steps in front of it, one by one, slowly, as if the darkness itself was thickening. Astronomers across the Concordat's outer systems reported it first. Then it was confirmed by automated stations, then by long-range Concordat military observers who sent messages back to their commands and then stopped sending messages. The Wrath Khan had arrived. Their fleet came through the galactic rim in a formation that was so wide it covered a region of space that would have taken an ordinary ship 3 days to cross at top speed. 80,000 vessels. The smallest of them was larger than any space station the Concordat had ever built. The largest, there were 9 of them right at the front of they were the size of small moons. Not compared to small moons. Actually the size of small moons. They had their own gravity, smaller ships drifted in orbit around them as the fleet moved. They moved at a pace that seemed slow from a distance, but was in fact terrifyingly fast, like watching a wave in the ocean from the shore. It looks gentle and far away until it is directly on top of you. Their signal was still broadcasting the same repeating pattern that the listening station had first detected. The Concordat's communications team had been working to decode it for weeks. When they finally did on the morning of the fleet's emergence, the message was 4 words long in every language the Wrath Khan had apparently ever encountered: submit or become silence. That was all. The Concordat's military command had been holding emergency sessions for days. There were technically a combined defense force ships from 23 of the 47 member species that had military capability. On paper it was an impressive number. In practice it was a force that had been built for border disputes and piracy suppression and the occasional territorial disagreement between members. It had never been built for something like this. No one had thought they would ever need it to be. Some species pulled their ships back before the battle even started. They did it quietly, routing their fleets away from the rim under the cover of resupply missions and training exercises. 3 species that had private back channel communications sent preliminary messages to the Wrath Khan fleet using the decoded signal structure expressing willingness to discuss terms. The Wrath Khan did not respond to those messages. They kept moving. What remained of the combined Concordat force, ships from 11 species, roughly 4,000 vessels, assembled at the Kareth line, and the name given to a defensive position near the last chain of outer system outposts. The commanders were brave. Kyle would give them that later. When he thought back on it, they were genuinely brave people who flew their ships into position knowing what was coming toward them. He would never say otherwise. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Later, the recordings from the sensor buoys would be studied for years. They showed a Concordat line that held for about 90 seconds before the Wrath Khan's forward weapons, which appeared to function by sending focused pulses of some energy type that had no name in the Concordat's physics lexicon directly through the hulls of enemy ships without, touching the space between, began cutting through the formation. The Concordat ships did not explode. Dramatically, they simply stopped working. Their systems went dead. Their hulls held for a moment and then crumpled as the internal pressure failed. In 11 minutes, 263 Concordat ships were destroyed, the rest scattered. 3 entire species lost their full military fleets in that engagement. Commanders who survived sent reports back using a tone that Cal recognized. The careful, flat tone of people describing something so bad that normal language did not feel adequate for it. In the Grand Assembly on Varith Prime, and the session was in continuous emergency mode, the Great Hall looked different from the inside now. Banners slightly crooked from having been rushed, chairs pulled out of their precise positions, food and drink brought in for senators who had not left. In 2 days, the translator systems were working so hard that they occasionally stuttered. People were talking over each other constantly. Kyle sat in his seat. He did not talk over anyone. If he had been watching Chancellor Abbott's face for the past several hours, she was doing her job with the skill and steadiness he had always respected in her, keeping the session moving, calling for order when the noise became unmanageable, summarizing positions and calling votes. But her face had changed over the past 2 days. There was something behind her eyes that had not been there before, something that Cale identified after careful consideration, whereas a woman who had already made a private decision and was now simply waiting for the room to arrive at the same place she already was. The room arrived there around the middle of the second day. Senator Sarath stood up. The room went quieter, not because Sarath asked it to, but because Sarath was old enough and important enough that when he stood, people wanted to hear what he said. His yellow eyes were steady. His long fingers were folded in front of him. He spoke slowly and with the full weight of someone who did not enjoy what they were saying but believed it was true. He said that the Concordat had to face the reality of the situation. He said that the combined military force had failed. He said that there was no secondary defensive option that the military advisors believed would succeed. He said that the Vrath-Kan fleet was moving toward the core worlds and would reach the first populated inner system in approximately 9 days. He said that what he was about to recommend was the most painful thing he had ever recommended in 40 years of public service, but that he had a responsibility to the living. He said the Concordat should open formal surrender negotiations. The room went very loud again. Some senators shouted in agreement. The relieved, desperate shout of people who had wanted someone else to say it first. Some shouted against it. Some stood in silence with expressions that were hard to read across species. Tuck Cale did not shout. He did not stand. He looked at the display screen in the center of the room that was showing in real time the position of the Vrath-Kan fleet. 80,000 ships moving at that slow, terrible pace toward everything they had all built. He checked his watch. The gesture was small and quiet and personal. He was not checking the time. He had been checking that watch in exactly that way since his message to Mace 2 weeks ago. Watch wait was the thing he did when he was waiting for something he was not allowed to talk about. Old habit, it helped him stay calm. The debate continued around him. Surrender terms were discussed in broad Language, someone raised the question of what exactly the Brathcon wanted since they had not responded to the preliminary messages. Each someone else pointed out that the original ancient records suggested they did not operate on a concept of wanting things in any way the Concordat could negotiate with. Someone else said that was defeatist. Someone else said that defeatism and realism were not the same thing. Kel listened to all of it. 9 days. Sarath had said Mace had the message. The fleet was moving. He believed that. He had to believe it. Because the alternative was to sit here and watch 47 civilizations spend their last week of existence arguing about the exact wording of a letter to something that did not read letters. On the far side of the galaxy, in the dark layer of space where light did not reach and sensors could not see, 3,000 ships were already in motion. He knew this the way he knew things he could not directly observe, through logic and trust and the understanding of the people involved. He had known Mace for 20 years. He had never once seen her be late. He was still thinking this when the alert came through. A new signal had been detected, not from the Brathcon, not from any Concordat relay station. It was coming from a region of space between the Concordat's outer defensive line, what remained of it, and the leading edge of the Brathcon fleet, a region of space that the Concordat's sensor network was quite sure contained nothing. Watch, the sensors were recording mass readings that did not correspond to any known object, gravitational distortions and patterns that the physics team could not identify. And this was the part that made the senior sensor operator on the Concordat's flagship lean very close to her screen and read the readout 3 times before she spoke. Energy signatures from drives of a type that were not in the Concordat's technical database, and the grand assembly on the main display shifted to show the sensor data. The debate stopped. Everyone looked at the same image, an area of what should have been empty space now showing readings that indicated the presence of something enormous and entirely unidentified. Kyle looked at the display. He breathed. Slowly, he felt something move through him that was not quite relief and not quite pride, but was somewhere between the two. A feeling that had no clean name, but was warm and deep and steady. On the Brathcon command vessel, which was one of the 9 moon-sized ships at the front of the formation, the lead commander was also looking at sensor readings he did not understand. He was a being who had lived for 400 years and who had overseen the silencing of 11 civilizations across 3 galaxies. He had not encountered a new sensation in a very long time. He was encountering one now. His sensor operators were reporting impossible things, a mass signatures from a region of space that their own pre-arrival survey had confirmed as empty. Gravitational distortions forming in geometric patterns that suggested structure and intention, and spreading around the outer edges of his fleet on all vectors in a formation that was already complete before his early warning systems had detected anything at all. A vast collection of objects that did not reflect his scanning signals and did not appear on his thermal imaging and should not, by any physical law he had ever encountered, exist. He sent a query to his science division. They responded in a way that would in a human be called confused. They could confirm the mass readings. They could not explain them. The objects, whatever they were, appeared to be occupying the boundary layer between ordinary space and dark matter simultaneously, a state that is civilization science described as theoretically impossible. He sent a message to his fleet captains. Why? He kept it short because he was not someone who used many words. He wrote, "What are those?" before any answer came back. A transmission arrived. On an open channel, it was in a language his system did not recognize. His translation algorithm processed it. In a few seconds, pulling from the database of every language his fleet had encountered in 400 years of travel across 3 galaxies, the language was not in the database. His system flagged it as entirely new, and he had the translation algorithm work from first principles using pattern and context and frequency. It took 47 seconds. When the translation came through, he read it twice, then he read it a third time. Message said, "We are humanity. You have never heard of us." That was the plan. He sat with that for a moment. 400 years old, 11 civilizations silenced, countless species encountered, cataloged and ended. He had never. All of that. He received a message that he found surprising. He found this one surprising. Outside his ship in the dark around his fleet, 3,000 things that were not quite ships and not quite shadows held their positions in perfect silence, waiting. And in the grand assembly on Verith Prime, Kelvus finally quietly stood up from his chair. The first shot was not fired by humanity. The Vrathcan commander was not a being who waiting in his 400 years of experience. It was something you did when you were not sure you would win. He was always sure he would win. So when the unidentified mass signatures began to firm up around his fleet, when his sensor operators confirmed beyond any doubt that something real and physical had surrounded them on every approach vector, he did what he had always done. He attacked. The Vrathcan forward weapons were the same weapons that had ended the Concordat's defense force in 11 minutes. They fired without sound and without visible light, a pulse of focused energy that traveled at speeds that made ordinary deflection systems useless. They were weapons designed around one assumption: the enemy does not know they are coming until it is already too late. The first volley hit nothing, not because the human ships moved. They did not move. The Vrathcan weapons passed through the positions where the mass readings indicated ships should be and found empty space and kept going home and eventually dissipated in the dark matter layer with no effect. The sensor operators rechecked their readings. The mass signatures were still there. The ships were still there. They were simply not in the way the weapons expected them to be. The science officer on the command vessel sent a message that translated roughly as, "They are not fully present in ordinary space." The commander read this and understood, for the first time in a very long while, how different that he was fighting something he did not have a model for. He made adjustments. He spread his firing pattern wider. He redirected weapons from the outer fleet to concentrate on the areas of highest mass reading. He did the things he had always done when something did not work the first time. He did more of it faster. Then the human fleet moved. It did not move the way ships moved. There was no engine burn, no visible thrust, but no shift in position that built up from a slower speed to a faster one. The dark Matter ships simply were in one place, and then were in another. The way a thought moves from one part of your mind to another, with no measurable journey between. They appeared inside the Varath Khan formation between ships alongside the great moon-sized dreadnoughts in the dead space between weapons batteries and the forward command vessels. And then they opened fire. The dark matter weapons were not energy pulses, they were collapses. A human dark matter weapon worked by creating a localized instability in the boundary between ordinary space and dark matter. A small, precise, terrible tearing, and then directing that tear at a target. When it hit, it did not burn or blast, it pulled. It pulled the target's matter through the tear and scattered it across a layer of the universe where nothing could exist in organized form. Ships hit by dark matter weapons did not explode, they came apart from the inside, silently, as if they had never been quite as solid as they believed. The Varath Khan had never lost a ship before, not one in 400 years. In the first 4 minutes of the battle, they lost 60 ships. Gone, not fleeing, not damaged. Gone. The commander ordered a tactical reorganization. He brought his 9 moon-sized dreadnoughts to the front by using their massive gravity fields to attempt to anchor the dark matter layer and prevent the human ships from using it as a transit medium. It was a smart idea. It was in fact one of the 3 responses that Admiral Mace had identified in her planning as the most likely Varath Khan counter move. She had planned for all 3. Mace was on the bridge of her flagship, the Darkfall Prime, a ship that looked from the outside like a tear in space, a shape made of absence rather than presence, or is surrounded by a shimmer at its edges where ordinary light bent away from it rather than reflecting. She stood at the command display with Dove beside her and watched the battle develop in real time across a tactical screen that showed both ordinary space and the dark matter layer simultaneously, a view of reality that no Concordat ship had ever been equipped to see. The battle was not clean. She had known it would not be. She had been at war with the idea of this battle for 19 years, and she knew better than anyone that no plan stayed whole past the first contact with a real enemy. The Varath Khan were adapting. They were, she had to admit to herself, very good at what they did. Their formation shifts were fast. Their communication between ships was faster than anything the Concordat used. They were learning in real time to respond to something they had never seen before. They were learning, all right, but they were behind because humanity had not built these ships in response to the Varath Khan signal. They had built them over 150 years, and in those 150 years, they had done what humans always did when they were given time and a problem and a reason. They had studied everything. They had found every record of every civilization the Varath Khan had ever destroyed. They had pulled the wreckage records from ancient data archives, had pieced together sensor readings from species that no longer existed to report them, reconstructed battle patterns from the fragmented histories of 14 extinct peoples. They had built a model of how the Varath Khan fought. They had tested that model against every counter strategy they could imagine. They had planned for 100 different versions of this battle, run the simulations thousands of times, found the weaknesses, and built weapons and tactics specifically designed to reach them. The Varath Khan were learning in real time, humanity had already graduated. The losses came anyway. Mace watched them happen and she did not look away. Ship designations went dark on her. Display one by one. Not many compared to the enemy, but each one was a crew, real people she had trained and briefed and shaken hands with. Each dark indicator on the screen was a collection of people who had gone into the dark to do this job and would not come back. She owed it to them to watch everyone. 941 human ships lost in the first hour. 41 out of 3,000. The Vrathcan had lost. 900. The battle shifted when the Vrathcan commander made his most dangerous move. He pulled 3 of the 9 moon dreadnoughts out of their anchor positions and sent them in a direct charge at what the Vrathcan sensors had identified as the highest concentration of human ships, a cluster near the fleet's port side, where a complex series of attacks was underway. The dreadnoughts were so massive that even dark matter weapons took multiple sustained hits to damage them significantly. Their charge was slow, but it was enormous, a wall of gravity and armor, moving toward a position that the human fleet could not simply abandon. The 3rd dreadnought in that charge aimed its course directly at the Darkfall Prime. It was not an accident. The Vrathcan commander had spent the battle trying to identify the human command vessel. He had done it through pattern recognition, watching which ship's movements proceeded, coordinated fleet responses, which position the other ship seemed to orbit in their decision-making. He was very good at reading command patterns. He had found Mace's ship inside 90 minutes, which she would later describe as faster than she expected and still not fast enough. Dove said very quietly, standing at her left shoulder, "Admiral." Mace looked at the incoming dreadnought on the display. Mace, she looked at the trajectory. She looked at the distance and the speed and the weapons charge building on the dreadnought's forward hull. She thought about 3 options in approximately 4 seconds. 2 of them involved moving the Darkfall Prime away. 1 of them did not. She chose the one that did not. She said, "All power to the dark matter core, set boundary, collapse to maximum depth, to target the dreadnought's internal gravity anchor. That is the point where its own mass holds it together. We are going in." Dove said, "Going in." The Darkfall Prime moved in the way dark matter ships moved without journey, without warning, and appeared inside the dreadnought's outer hull, not attached to it, not colliding with it, inside it in the space between the dreadnought's outer armor and its internal structures, a space the size of a small city, while the dark matter core of the Darkfall Prime generated its collapse field at maximum depth, aimed at the gravity anchor at the dreadnought's center. The result was not an explosion. The dreadnought simply lost cohesion. Its matter, all of it, billions of tons of the most advanced armor and weapons and engineering its civilization had ever built, came apart along its own structural lines, pulled apart from its center by a collapse field that was only active for 3 seconds, but 3 seconds was enough. The Darkfall Prime emerged from the debris field with its outer hull scorched in 17 places and 3 decks open to space. Running lights along its port side were gone. One of its dark matter cores was producing irregular readings that Dove would spend 2 weeks repairing. It was still flying, the Vrathcan formation After the loss of 3 dreadnoughts in rapid succession began to change, not a reorganization this time, a withdrawal. The remaining ships at the edges of the formation began pulling back, attempting to open a corridor to the galactic rim and the dark space beyond it through which they had come. Mace looked at this on the display and thought about 14 species. She thought about the records she had read, the wreckage she had studied, the ancient and broken histories of people who had not survived to write their own endings. She thought about the civilization that had for 40,000 years had not believed that silence was something they handed to others. She gave the final order. The dark matter fleet moved to surround the retreat corridor, not to block it, to reshape it, using a coordinated dark matter collapse across 60 ships in precise geometric positions. They folded the corridor. They bent the space through which the Vrath clan intended to escape, curled it redirected it with the kind of precision that required the simultaneous perfect execution of 60 crews, and that humanity had rehearsed in simulation 911 times. The fold held the remaining Vrath clan ships, 46,000 of them, accelerated into their retreat corridor and emerged not in dark space but inside the outer corona of the nearest star, at a point where no ship made of matter in ordinary space could survive. For more than seconds, the star flared once, bright enough that it was visible from Vareth Prime with the naked eye, a brief second sun in the sky that lasted for less than a minute and then faded. Then there was nothing where 80,000 ships had been. May stood at her display for a long time without speaking. The room around her was very quiet. People who had been working at a controlled intensity for hours were now still, the way people are still after something enormous has ended, and the world has not yet caught up with the fact that it is over. Dove said eventually, "It's done." She said yes. She thought about 41 ships, 41 crews. She would read every name. She always did. She would read them the way you read something that deserves to be read. Slowly, all the way through without skipping anything, giving each word its full weight, across the galaxy, on every concordant sensor station that had been watching the battle through long-range feeds. Screens had gone very bright for a moment when the star flared, and then the screens had returned to normal, and where the Vrath conflict had been there was nothing but clean, quiet space. In the grand assembly on Vareth Prime, the feed from the sensor network had been playing on the main display throughout the battle. Every senator had watched. 47 species had sat in silence, watching a battle they had no part in, fought by a people they had spent 2 centuries underestimating. The hall was absolutely quiet when it ended. Senator Sarath sat with his long fingers folded on the desk in front of him, and his clear throat, yellow eyes fixed on the display which now showed only stars. He looked like a man who was doing arithmetic in his head. Very important, very personal. Arithmetic, the kind that changes the answer to questions you thought you already knew. He looked like a man recalculating everything. 3 weeks after the battle, Kale Voss walked back into the grand assembly of Vareth Prime. He did not walk in alone. 2 officers of the Dark Fall Fleet walked behind him, a man and a woman, both in the simple black void suits that served as the fleet's uniform. The suits had no insignia, no rank markings, no decorations of any kind. They were the color of deep space. Kale himself wore his standard diplomatic clothes. Clean, simple, other kind of thing he had worn to this hall 1,000 times. He carried nothing. He had left his notepad behind. The doors of the assembly opened in front of him, and he walked in at a steady pace. Not hurrying, not performing, just walking. Every senator in the room stood up. It happened without announcement, without a call to order, without anyone leading it. They simply stood, all 47 species, in the same moment, in the way people sometimes do when a situation makes the right response completely clear without anyone having to explain it. Cal noticed this and did not let it show on his face. He walked to his seat, the human seat in the row toward the back of the hall where junior member species sat, and he put his hands on the back of the chair and looked at Chancellor Avoth at the front of the room. She nodded to him. He pulled out his chair and sat down. Well, there was a long moment of quiet before anyone else moved. Then slowly the room sat back down around him. Chancellor Avoth called the session to order. Her voice was steady, which Cal respected because he was fairly certain this was the hardest session she had ever called. She announced that the primary item of business was a full accounting of the events of the past 3 weeks, and in that, associated with this accounting, there were several matters of record that would be introduced as formal evidence into the Assembly archive. She looked at Cal when she said this last part. Cal stood briefly and said that he would be submitting 47 documents to the archive. He said it clearly and plainly without preamble. Then he sat down again. 47 documents, one for each species, and each document contained the full record of that species' government's communications over the past month. The back-channel messages sent to the Vrathcon expressing willingness to negotiate surrender, the private internal communications about withdrawing their fleets before the battle, the years-old records of deliberate political decisions to suppress human expansion and keep humanity in a position where they would not accumulate meaningful influence in the Concordat, and Cal had not gathered these documents by hacking or stealing. He had gathered them the same way he gathered everything, by watching, listening, and waiting until the right people sent him the right things, which they had over 11 years, because when people believe you are not very important, they become careless about what they say and send in rooms and channels where you are present but not considered a real audience. He had not used any of it. For 11 years he had collected and filed and said nothing. He had waited. Now he placed it all on the table. The reaction in the hall was not shouting this time. The shouting had already happened in the days immediately after the battle, in the panicked and exhausted and ashamed sessions where senators had tried to process what they had witnessed. What filled the hall now was something quieter and more durable. The sound of people who knew they had been seen, who weren't, who understood what that meant. Senator Sarath asked to speak. Abeth gave him the floor. He stood slowly in the way of a man for whom standing had become a careful project, and he looked at Kale from across the room with those yellow eyes that had always seemed to see things more clearly than most. He said that he wanted to ask Ambassador Voss a direct question, and that he hoped the ambassador would accept it in the spirit in which it was intended, not as an accusation. and not as flattery, but as a genuine inquiry from someone who was trying to understand. Kale said he would do his best. Sarath said, "Why did you not tell us?" The room went very quiet. Kale thought about it for a moment. He thought about how to say it in a way that was honest without being cruel and true without being theatrical. He had been thinking about this question for weeks because he had known it was coming and he had wanted to have the right answer ready. "Kale," he said, "you never asked what we were capable of. In 200 years, no one in this room ever looked at a human and wondered what we might be building or what we understood or what we had learned. You looked at us and saw what you decided we were before we ever opened our mouths. We were young, we were emotional, we were not yet ready. That was decided before you knew us, and because it was decided, you never looked hard enough to discover that you were wrong." He paused. "Admiral," he said, "we did not hide from you out of deception. We hid because the galaxy left us no room to be anything else. When you are told for 200 years that you are not ready for the table, you eventually build your own table in private, and you build it very carefully because you know that when the moment comes, it has to be enough." The room stayed quiet for a long time. After that, then the session continued. Because sessions always continue, and because the work of civilization does not pause for revelation. There were votes and proposals and counter proposals and procedural motions and all the complicated machinery of 47 species trying to govern something together. But everything moved differently now. The center of gravity in the room had shifted, not dramatically, not with any single loud moment, one but anyone who had sat in this hall before the battle and sat in it now would have been able to feel it the way the air feels, different after a long rain. Admiral Mace appeared by hologram. She was still on the repair station where she had been recovering, and the hologram was not perfect quality. It flickered slightly at the edges, and her voice had a faint static behind it. But her face was clear enough and her voice was steady enough, and the room listened to her with a kind of attention it had never given a human before. She was asked how long humanity had been developing the dark matter fleet. She said 150 years. She was asked who had authorized it. She said it had been a continuous project across multiple governments and administrations, always maintained, always funded, always kept outside of any treaty framework that Concord might have applied to human military development. She said this without apology because she did not consider it something to apologize for. She was asked the question Sarath had asked Kale in different words. Why the secrecy? Why the silence? She said, "Because you told us what we were not. For 200 years you made it very clear that humans were not ready, not advanced enough, not trustworthy enough to be treated as full partners." Janaya inspected our ships and delayed our research approvals and put us in border zones where nothing grew. You laughed at our ambassadors and ignored our scientists. We heard all of it, we understood all of it, and we decided that the best response was not to argue but to work, to keep working, until the day arrived when the argument was no longer necessary. She paused, and there was static in the pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. She said, "The day arrived, she said, that 41 human ships had been lost in the battle." She said their crew names would be entered into the Assembly's memorial archive if the assembly was willing. She said it simply as a practical matter, as a request rather than a demand. The assembly voted on it immediately. It was unanimous. The restructuring of the Concordat took months to negotiate in detail, but the broad decision was made. In that session, the existing charter was suspended. Pending revision, payday founding. Council of 5 seats was established. Not because 5 was a particularly significant number, but because it was the number that the working group agreed represented the most stable distribution of real authority. Humanity was assigned one of the 5 seats, not because the other species wanted to give it, because the alternative was to sit in a restructured concordat, pretending that the previous 2 weeks had not happened, and then no one in the hall had the energy for that level of pretending anymore. The species that had sent surrender messages to the Vrath clan were formally censored and placed under review. Some of their governments fell in the months that followed. Some held on. Watched all of it happen from his new seat, not in the back row, not in the junior section, but at the founding council table, with the same steady attention he had always given to rooms full of powerful people when he was still not a man who spoke much, but the quality of the silence he kept had changed. Before, his silence was the silence of someone who was not expected to speak. Now it was the silence of someone who was choosing not to, which was an entirely different thing, and everyone in the room understood the difference. On the repair station, in a medical bay that smelled of recycled air and equipment coolant, Mace read the names of 41 ships one more time. She did it the way she always did, all the way through, without skipping anything. Each name carried the names of the crew behind it, and she knew most of those names because she had made it her business to know them, because she believed that the people under her command deserved to be known. When she was done, she sat in the quiet of the medical bay for a while. The porthole beside her bed showed a view of open space, clean and dark and full of stars. In the way space always looked from the outside, beautiful and indifferent and enormous. She had spent her whole adult life in that darkness. She felt no particular desire to leave it. Dove came in to give her the repair status on the fleet. He stood at the foot of her bed with a tablet and read the numbers in his usual careful way. And she listened and asked questions and made notes, and it was the most normal thing that had happened in 3 weeks, and she was grateful for it. And when he was done, he stood there for a moment longer than the report required. She looked at him. He said, "They're talking about calling it the Dark Fall engagement for the history books." She thought about that. She said the Vrath Khan called the other 14 species silence, what they made of them. We should not use the same word for what we did. Dove said, "What would you call it?" She looked out at the stars. She thought about the mission, the secrecy, all the long years of building something enormous in the dark without recognition or credit or the knowledge of anyone outside of a very small and very careful circle of people. She thought about what they had built and why and what it had been for. She said, a conversation, a long overdue conversation. We just had to build our voice first. Dove wrote that down. He was that kind of person, someone who recognized when something deserved to be written down. Later, much later, and when the official histories of this period were compiled and debated and revised and compiled. Again, the historians would argue about what to call the moment. Some called it the Battle of the Rim, some called it the Dark Fall engagement, as Dove had suggested. Some used the phrase that had spread through every species media in the weeks following, the phrase that a young communications officer on a concordant relay station had used in a report that was supposed to be internal but had been leaked and read by approximately everyone in the galaxy within a week. She had written describing the moment. She watched the battle from long-range sensors and understood what was happening. This is what humanity kept in the dark. That phrase had stayed. It had a quality to it that made it stick. The double meaning of it, the darkness, as the place where the fleet had hidden, and also as the thing the fleet had mastered, the raw material of its power. On Varith Prime, on an observation deck, at the top of the assembly tower, Voss stood in the early morning before a session and looked at the sky. The stars were bright and cold and beautiful, the city spread out below him alive and moving, ships crossed the sky and banners of 47 species hung in the hall behind him. He thought about the 41 crews. He thought about you and how who had written a paper nobody read and changed the entire future of the galaxy. He thought about all the people who had worked in the dark for 150 years, unseen, unrecognized, building something the galaxy would never have let them build if they had asked permission. When he thought about the question he was sometimes asked now, whether humanity had any other surprises, he always smiled when people asked that. He never answered it because the answer was none of their business, and also because the smile was by itself exactly the right answer. The stars burned on above him. The same stars, the same light, the same ancient fire in the dark that had been there long before any civilization existed to look at them. But the dark between them was different now. The dark between them had been changed quietly and permanently by something that had lived in it for 150 years and had finally, when the moment was right, spoken, and the galaxy for the first time in 200 years was listening.